Bob is a national expert and has been interviewed by media, local and national in scope, not only on prison privatization, but also on detention and enforcement policies against immigrants. One of the most common things that happens when we do a presentation on the prison system in America is that people want to know what can be done, what can we do, how can we have any influence at all on conditions and on the industrialization of American prisons. Grassroots Leadership points out on their website that young people can be organized to be activists, that people of faith can be involved in visitation programs. We here at the ACLU had an action this summer during the heat wave. Remember when it hit 95, 98 for about a week here? The prison system has an agreement with the power company that they will power down during a heat wave, shut off the air conditioning and the lights so that power can be redirected. And they're paid money to do that. Meanwhile, prisoners are living in horrible conditions, as are the staff working in these prisons when they're powered down. We did an e-blast to all of our friends, asking them to write the director of prisons and protest the cutting off of power. And we had a stunning response. I think we had 400 or 500 emails went into the director of prisons within 8 hours that day, and they turned the power back on. That's a great short-term victory. Now we have to work for the long-term solutions, and it's those kinds of actions that Bob's in. So, Bob, I'll let you take over with that.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the ACLU of Ohio, both for having me tonight and also for the amazing work that the ACLU of Ohio does. We had the pleasure of working with Mike Brickner and several folks from this organization over the last couple of years in the fight to stop many of Ohio's prisons from being sold off to private prison corporations. So I work with Grassroots Leadership, and Grassroots Leadership is a 33-year-old Southern-based social justice organization. We were started by a civil rights organizer named Cy Khan, whose background goes back to going south in the 60s and working with SNCC in the civil rights movement, and staying and building organizations to work across building progressive organizations in the southern United States to work across lines of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, so many of the divisions that were historically dividing the communities that we worked in. Grassroots Leadership took on a campaign in the 90s to look at the privatization of public resources as one of the phenomena that was rolling back many of the gains that the civil rights and labor movements had made in the 60s and 70s. And so we looked at privatization of public resources in the context of healthcare, in the context of utilities, water, electricity, what it was doing to the communities we were working in. And then we stumbled across this issue of the privatization of the criminal justice system, which was an issue that dovetailed with another issue that was impacting many of the communities, particularly African-American communities that we were working in the southern United States, which was the rise of mass incarceration in the United States. And so I'm here tonight. I actually got my start doing this work when I was a student at the University of Texas, and we found out that the concessions provider at the University of Texas football stadium, which is big business for any sports fans. On that note, I'll note that I didn't realize that this was scheduled several months ago, and we didn't realize that it was going to have the big sporting conflict, and so we're going to be done by 8:07 today. So I got my start doing this work when we found out as students at the University of Texas that our the concessions provider at the University of Texas football stadium, was also the biggest investor in for-profit prisons in the United States. And so we started a campaign to organize to divest our university from the private prison system. Ultimately, it led to students, including myself, being arrested in the administration office, and it really led to something that became a lifelong passion of mine to end this practice of corporations profiting off of the incarceration of human beings. And so today I want to talk about this industry that is the private prison system, an industry that has profited from and at times contributed to the United States becoming the most incarcerated place in the history of the world. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history of the industry, talk about some of the problems. A lot of this traces pretty closely this report, the Dirty 30, Nothing to Celebrate About 30 Years of Corrections Corporation of America, that Grassroots leadership put out with our allies across the country in the Public Safety and Justice campaign. And then I want to talk about not just the bad stuff, right, but also talk about some of the inspiring organizing that's happening around the country and some of the ways that I think that there can be interventions against this industry. The modern private prison industry was started in the 1980s, right? It was started in 1983 with the founding of Corrections Corporation of America. Corrections Corporation of America is the oldest and largest of the private prison corporations, and it was started by an investment consortium that had already started Hospital Corporation of America, and before that had started Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so Hospital Corporation of America makes some sense, right? It's kind of the privatization of typically public resources. Kentucky Fried Chicken, a little more random. CCA was started in Nashville, Tennessee. It is still a Nashville-based corporation. And its first contract was from what was then called Immigration and Naturalization Services to open the Houston Processing Center to hold immigrants and asylum seekers, many coming from Central America at the time, fleeing the civil wars of Central America in the 1980s. It was founded on the principle, according to co-founder Tom Beasley, that you could sell prisons just like you could sell anything else, like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers. And so it was, that was kind of the jumping off point, that prisons were just another product to be sold. Since the company's founding, the United States has seen a massive growth in prisons and immigration detention facilities. I think many people in this room probably know that we are the most incarcerated place in the history of the world. Since 1983, our incarcerated population has grown by 500% to more than 2.2 million people in prisons and jails in the United States. We've seen a corresponding increase in the number of people who are locked up because of their immigration status. At the time of the founding of CCA, there were only a couple hundred people who were detained for their immigration status on any given day. Today, that number is more than 32,000, and there is a government mandate that we must detain that number of people every single day. And I'm not chalking up the rise in incarceration solely to the introduction of the profit motive, although I think it is a contributing factor. Certainly, the rise of the war on drugs, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing policies, a number of heightened tough-on-crime policies combined to contribute to the rise of this industry. And so, one of the questions is, well, how do you make money off of running a prison? This is an industry that has grown to be an approximately $4 billion a year industry. The publicly traded corporations CCA and GEO combined to have more than $3 billion in annual revenue and control more than 163,000 prison beds across the country. And the model is basically a per diem model, right, where a government agency will pay a per prisoner per day fee to the private entity. The private prison industry is strongest in the southern states, which tend to have the highest incarceration rates. They tend to have the most immigration detention beds, and they also tend to have the highest racial disparities amongst incarcerated people. The private prison corporations both own and lease facilities. So in some states like Texas, the majority of the facilities are owned by the state and then leased to private prison corporations. We'll talk a little bit more about here in Ohio, where the industry, where CCA actually bought a state-owned facility, and some of the problems that that brings up. I'll talk just briefly about some of the major players in this industry. As I mentioned, Corrections Corporation of America is the oldest and largest of the private prison companies. Its revenues now top $1.7 billion. They're celebrating their 30th anniversary across the country. There are more than 80,000 inmates housed in more than 60 CCA facilities around the country. CCA's biggest competitor is a company called the GEO Group, which is formerly Wackenhut Corrections Corporation. It comes out of the Wackenhut security firm. It's a Florida-based company. I think some of the unique things about GEO Group is that it has an international presence. It's opened prisons in South Africa, in England, in the UK, and in Australia and New Zealand. Kind of all of the English-speaking, many of the English-speaking countries around the world. And it's also a company that's getting into new markets, which is something that I think that people around the country should be aware of. This is a company that is trying to break into things like running mental health facilities, community corrections, civil commitment facilities, and electronic monitoring, sort of the alternative to detention industry. Just briefly, I'll mention that some of the GEO and CCA are the two publicly traded corporations, right? So you can buy and trade GEO and CCA stock on the stock market. There are a number of growing privately held companies, including Management and Training Corporation, which is a Utah-based company. I say Canadian history there because I was in Canada last week and was presenting some of these slides to the Public Employees Union, and the Canadian history of prison privatization was basically that the state of Ontario opened a public facility and opened an almost identical private facility as one of the best sort of apples to apples comparisons of what happens in public and private facilities. And the private facility performed worse in nearly every single metric, and it was eventually taken back under state control. And then there are a number of other smaller facilities, community education centers, which I think may rival Management and Training Corporation for the most Orwellian of private prison names. You wouldn't think by a company called Community Education Centers that they would be operating secure prison facilities, but that is in fact their business. This is a company that made the New York Times front page with a series of exposés last year based on their political connections to the political leadership in New Jersey, notably Chris Christie, and also the violence that was so prevalent in the halfway houses. And then those other three companies, Emerald, LCS, and LaSalle Southwest, are all Louisiana-based companies. So what are some of the problems with this idea of outsourcing corrections, right? I think that the biggest of them is that it incentivizes high incarceration rates. And it does that in a number of ways that I want to talk about. First and foremost, and I think that the way that most people think about it is that private prison corporations spend millions of dollars every year on lobbying and campaign contributions, right? They swear up and down that they're not trying to influence the policies that send people to prison, but then you often are wondering, well, what are you spending these millions of dollars doing? And in fact, they've been caught several times lobbying or giving campaign contributions or attempting to influence legislation in other ways. For instance, both CCA and GEO Group sat on the Public Safety Task Force of the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which is a very influential association of mostly Republican legislators from around the country. And essentially what that entity was able to do was to write model legislation that then state legislators would bring back and introduce into their legislatures. And while CCA and GEO were sitting on they were actually chairing the task force of this, the Public Safety Task Force of ALEC, they were able to write laws, including truth in sentencing laws, including mandatory minimum laws that extended the sentences of people who were incarcerated, which was clearly good for their business. Another way, and I think a very insidious way, that private prison corporations incentivize incarceration is by bed guarantees. And this was a report that was put out by our allies in the public interest last week that found that more than 65% of all of the of all state contracts, or I'm sorry, more than 60% of all state contracts with private prison corporations contain a bed guarantee, oftentimes of 90 to 100%. So what does that mean? That basically means that if a state enters into a long-term contract with a private prison corporation and they have to fill 90% of those beds contractually, or at least they have to pay for 90% of those beds, then there's no economic incentive to reduce the number of people in prison. There are a couple places in Texas, a couple of counties actually, that have found themselves trapped by these agreements where there's a bed guarantee or a per diem rate shift built into the contract, whereby they've successfully been able to reduce the number of people in jail, right? Something that's good for the people who are in jail, good for the community, good for taxpayers, right? But the private prison corporations' contracts have said either that you have to pay a higher per diem if your jail population falls below a certain rate, or you have to pay for a certain bed guarantee. So say 90% of the people who, 90% occupancy rate. And I think that because we're here in Ohio, and we'll talk a little bit about Ohio, but the one prison that was a publicly operated prison that was sold to a private prison corporation was the Lake Erie facility here in Ohio. And that facility was sold, and I think that the lease was 20 years. So basically the state sold it to Corrections Corporation of America and then entered into a 20-year leaseback agreement with the prison corporation. And over those 20 years, there was a 90% occupancy guarantee that was built into that contract. So if the state of Ohio successfully reduces its prison population, which I think should be the goal, right? Public safety, reduce number of people in prison, then they would have a very difficult time justifying it economically to reduce the prison population at this facility. And the industry is not shy about it, right? The industry is not shy, and in fact, because CCA and GEO Group are publicly traded corporations, they have to put out documents to their shareholders articulating what are some of the risks to our shareholders, what are some of the risks to our company, what are some of the risks to our industry. So they say things like, the demand for our facilities could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently prescribed by our criminal laws. Or, we have been successful in increasing the number of residents in our state, in our care, and by residents, they mean prisoners, right? And continue to pursue a number of initiatives intended to further increase our occupancy and revenue. So I think that some of the other problems with prison privatization include, what I call staffing nightmares. The way that a private prison corporation generally makes money is that it takes the money that the state gives on a per diem basis per prisoner, and it spends less of it in the facility, right? So that can mean things like cutting rehabilitation or education programs, but the biggest single way that a private prison corporation can save money is by slashing the benefits and pay of the staff in the facility. A study by the Bureau of Prisons found that private prisons pay equal to about $5,000 less in annual salary for new recruits and about almost $15,000 less for the maximum annual salary for a correctional officer. Now you contrast that with the pay of top executives at private prison corporations. CCA's head, Damon Hinninger, last year made almost $3,700,000. And GEO's CEO made $5,700,000, right? So basically what this is a wealth redistribution scheme whereby but distributing the wealth upwards, right? Not to the people who are working in the facilities and certainly not to the people who are incarcerated in the facilities, whereby money is taken from the people who work in the facilities and invested into executive salaries and lobbying and campaign contributions. And the result of that is extremely high turnover rates. The last year that the industry reported its own turnover rates was the year 2000, and it found that there was 53% turnover rates in their facilities across the country. Now imagine your workplace, regardless of what it is, on a 53% annual turnover rate. It's hard to imagine, right? Now imagine a prison facility, something that is fairly volatile, right, where continuity and consistency is something that is valued, right, at a more than 50% turnover rate. And in fact, in 2009, a Texas state study found that our privately operated prisons had a 90% annual turnover rate amongst the staff in the facility. And the result of that, right, is, well, no, I'll just explain the ghost staffing thing because I think it's interesting. The state of Idaho has one privately operated prison, and it's known by the prisoners in the facility as the gladiator school because it's so violent. And one of the consistent complaints by the prisoners is that there's just no staff there, right? That the staffing is inconsistent, that it's understaffed. And in an ACLU of Idaho, in a national ACLU lawsuit, around the facility's conditions, basically found that a federal judge in that case found Corrections Corporation of America in contempt of court because it was falsely reporting its staffing levels. And basically it was saying that they were putting more staff in the facility than were actually there. And what this leads to is bad outcomes for the people who are staffing the facility, but certainly also bad outcomes for the people who are incarcerated in these facilities. And so a criminologist named James Austin found that privately operated facilities have higher rates of violence, both against prisoner-on-staff violence and prisoner-on-prisoner violence. That it's also been found that there are lower rates of programming within privately operated facilities and therefore higher rates of recidivism. In fact, there's a study out of Minnesota that's coming out just this month that found that the lone private prison in that state experienced much higher recidivism rates. And then there's some fairly spectacular examples of prisoner abuse. And I'm not going to go into those, but I think that the result of many of these institutional problems is that there's some very horrendous things that happen in these facilities. And certainly there are horrendous things that happen in all prison facilities, but I think that the institutional factors in the private facilities make it more likely in the privately operated facilities. So to talk about a sort of case study in private prison disasters here in Ohio, the Lake Erie Correctional Institution. This was the first facility in the country that had been a state-operated facility and then was sold to a private prison corporation. And CCA purchased it from the state in 2011 for almost $73 million. But in return, they wanted guaranteed payment for 90% of the beds in the facility, so basically a 90% occupancy guarantee over the course of a 20-year lease. And it almost immediately turned really bad. The turnover rate spiked. A state audit found that there were increases in assaults, fights, disturbances, and use of force. And we actually highlighted this as one of the 30 sort of worst cases in our Dirty 30 report. But really the best document about this is an ACLU of Ohio document that catalogs what happened in this facility when it was taken over by the private prison company. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening in terms of trends in for-profit prisons. One thing I'll just mention is that there's been some pretty major industry consolidation. GEO has purchased a private prison corporation called Correctional Services Company. They also purchased the third largest private prison company called Cornell Corrections. And they have recently purchased an electronic monitoring company called Behavioral Interventions. One of the principles, right, of one of the values that private prison corporations often promote is that there's competition, right, and therefore competition is going to make the product better. But increasingly, there are fewer and fewer operators out there. There's really 2 or 3 major ones. Another thing that I think that is important to note is that these are companies that in many states are seeing prison populations decline, right? And where we have crime rates in many states that are reaching lows that we haven't seen in 30 years. We have falling prisoner populations in many states, even Texas, right, which has more incarcerated people than any place in the country. We've seen a population decline by almost 10,000 prisoners over the last 4 or 5 years. And so these are companies that are seeking new markets. And one of those markets is mental health care. GEO Group in particular has a subsidiary that has had to spin off part of it, which is something we probably don't need to get into the details of, but that is attempting to take over forensic mental health facilities in states across the country. And they've been successful in some places, but they've also been fought in many other states, including in Texas, where we were able to put together a concerted campaign of mental health advocates and civil liberties and civil rights organizations and criminal justice reform organizations that knew the history of this company in order to stop them from taking over a state mental health hospital last year. I think one other trend is that there's that both CCA and GEO Group have recently converted to be real estate investment trusts or REITs, which basically says that their primary business is not incarceration but owning property. So like hotels can be REITs, hotel chains, and becoming a REIT is basically a federal tax adjustment that allows them to save tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in federal taxes every year. And then I think that the other major trend is that because of the declining population in many states in terms of the incarcerated population, what the private prison corporations have done has been to turn to the detention and incarceration of immigrants as a major profit center for these companies. And so what you see on this graph is basically the spike in annual revenues that are provided by the federal government in CCA and GEO. And if you were to look at a similar graph for state governments, it would be much more level. And the reason for this, and you see that it very much corresponds with the revenues that the companies are bringing in. And the reason for this is because the federal government now spends nearly $2 billion every year detaining immigrants simply for being in the country either without papers or fighting to stay here if their immigration status is in question. And half of all of those immigration detention beds are operated by private prison companies. The government also now commits more than $1 billion a year towards criminally incarcerating immigrants for one of 2 crimes, either coming into the country without papers or returning after being deported. These are now the 2 most criminally prosecuted crimes in the entire federal judiciary, are immigration offenses. And we did a report last year. There's a policy called Operation Streamline that's basically a zero-tolerance policy along the border that funnels immigrants not only into the immigration detention system, but also is criminally prosecuting them and sending them to the either criminal detention systems operated by the U.S. Marshals Service or by the Bureau of Prisons. And our report found that since 2005, since the onset of this program, Operation Streamline, we've committed more than $6.5 billion towards incarcerating immigrants simply for coming into the country without papers. And again, the industry recognizes this is the case. George Zolli, the man who's paid more than $5 million a year for operating this company, says the main driver of growth for the new beds at the federal level continues to be the detention and incarceration of criminal aliens. So that's the bad stuff. Sometimes I feel like I'm talking about a dystopic science fiction novel or something where there are men in suits in boardrooms figuring out ways to make money off of putting people in prison. I think that the good news is that thanks to organizations around the country, including ACLU affiliates in many places, the ACLU of Ohio, civil rights, civil liberty organizations, faith organizations, labor organizations, that private prison corporations are on the defensive in a way that they haven't been in the entirety of the time that I've been working on this issue, right, for the last 13 or 14 years. And one of the advocacy strategies that we've employed is building very broad coalitions to be able to either fight private prison attempts to take over facilities or to affirmatively go in and say that we should be closing prisons and we should be closing the private facilities first. And one of those efforts is something called the Public Safety and Justice Campaign, which is a broad coalition of faith, human rights, civil rights, and civil liberties organizations that have come together with labor organizations, including labor organizations that represent correctional officers and other staff in correctional facilities, to recognize that we might not always have exactly the same priorities, right? Sometimes, we might even be on the opposite side of certain fights. But when it comes to prison privatization, that we know that the privatization of correctional facilities is both bad for the people who are incarcerated in these facilities and is bad for the people who work in them. And so the Public Safety and Justice Campaign has developed a series of principles that I won't read, but basically to articulate that public safety and justice is undermined when you privatize correctional services. And I think that what these principles do is they lay out why it's bad, both for people who are incarcerated, for people who work in facilities, and also for taxpayers to have a profit motive in the correction system. And so we've undertaken a series of activities over the last couple of years. One of them, and I think that this sort of spans research, legislative activity, and grassroots organizing. Some of the research that we've done includes the CCA Dirty 30 report, chronicling the 30 years of Corrections Corporation of America. Our partners in the public interest just put out this report that actually got some really fabulous media coverage around the country about why there shouldn't be contracts where there are bed guarantees to fill a number of prison beds. We'll be releasing a report next month, or actually later this month, it's October, around the interstate transfer of prisoners. This is another thing that private prison corporations have pioneered in many ways, is building speculative prisons around the country. So just going out and building a prison, say in Oklahoma or Arizona, and then finding somebody to put in it, and not really caring if it's from the jurisdiction where the prison is located. So there are more than 9,000 California prisoners who are in prisons in Oklahoma and Arizona and Mississippi. There are, I think, 1,000 Hawaii prisoners who are in the desert of Arizona. So if you can imagine, if you're a native Hawaiian and you end up in a prison in Arizona, what that can do to your ability to be in touch with your family for the rehabilitation services, for the community contact that you need in order to re-enter society successfully when you get out of prison. So we'll be releasing that report later this month. We've also been able to undergo some legislative fights around the country. In Florida, a couple years ago, we were able to beat back a proposal that would have privatized 29 state prisons with one bill. In New Hampshire, the state came very close to privatizing its entire prison system. And then New Hampshire has a very small prison system, but it would have been the first state to turn over its entire prison system to a private corporation. Folks on the ground there, the labor union, the ACLU, the faith organizations came together and were able to stop that, and then actually turned it around so much, the public opinion in that state around this issue, that within a year, the debate had changed from privatizing the entire prison system to a bill that would have banned the privatization of prisons forever within New Hampshire, passed the state assembly, came within a vote or two in committee in the state senate of passing, and the governor, the new governor, had agreed that he would have signed the bill. So a real sea change. And even in Texas, where we don't often have a lot of good things to report, period. Even in Texas, we've been able to turn the tide in many ways. Texas has more private prisons, period, than any other place in the country. But this last legislative session, we were able to convince lawmakers to close 2 privately operated prisons, and that were more than 5,000 prison beds were taken offline, including a notorious prison, the Dawson State Jail in downtown Dallas, where several women had died of preventable illnesses over the last couple of years. And in a really tragic story, a young woman was denied prenatal care and in fact denied a pregnancy test and had a very premature child while locked in a solitary confinement unit, and her little girl died after a couple days at that facility. And so there's a real sort of added urgency to closing down that prison. And I just put this up here. As part of the Dirty 30 campaign, one of the things we really wanted to do, besides doing the report, is we've been doing a series of protests around the country at Corrections Corporation of America facilities. They're going around the country saying, isn't it great that we've turned our business into a $1.7 billion a year company? And so this is a protest outside of the shareholder meetings in Nashville, Tennessee in June. We've had other protests in Texas, in DC, and in other places around the country. And in fact, just today, a bunch of immigrant rights organizations in New York City did a protest outside of a private prison analyst meeting that got some pretty good media coverage. And so if that's something that people in Ohio are interested in organizing around, we would be glad to send down the banners and all of the materials for it. The other thing is that we've launched a video series. This isn't like professionally made videos or anything like that, but the idea was that in the age of social media, that we should be able to tell the private prison industry what we think about 30 years of for-profit incarceration. And so we've approached, a series of artists. This is the hip-hop artist from Detroit, Invincible. And other people. This is Alex Friedman, who is a formerly incarcerated person in a CCA facility in Nashville, to basically come together and make short videos of what their perspective is on 30 years of for-profit incarceration. So this is one from a board member of ours and someone from the United Methodist Church, just as an example. So, one of the things that we've tried to get people to do is just to make these videos, and we're trying to do it throughout 2013. So if this is something that is interesting to people, a lot of these are just made on people's phones and then uploaded to YouTube or on our page on the Nation Inside, the nationinside.org has instructions on how you can upload your film and get it distributed on social media, about why, from your perspective, there's nothing to celebrate about 30 years of profiting off of incarceration. Oh, and then I wanted to mention one other thing. I think that one of the reasons that we wanted to do that video series is because one of the things that we've found is that this is an industry that may be written about on occasion in the paper, but is generally not something that people know about. When I do talks around the country, or if I'm sitting on an airplane and somebody asks me, what I'm working on, and I tell them something about companies that make money off of incarceration, generally people say, what are you talking about, right? That doesn't make any sense. And what we've noticed is that this is an industry that thrives when it is in the shadows. And so one of our goals is to take it out of the shadows and to make it something that people know about and something that people act on. And sometimes the private prison industry gives us gifts. And one of those gifts was when Geo Group decided that it wanted to go mainstream and get its name on the football stadium of Florida Atlantic University, which is a university in Boca Raton, the same town that Geo Group is on. And what happened next, I think Geo they were going to buy the naming rights. So can you imagine playing football in, private prison field or private prison stadium run by Geo Group? What happened next is that people started talking about the Geo Group and talking about this industry of profiting off of incarceration. The first time that the New York Times ever quoted Grassroots leadership was on the sports page, right? It was on talking about this company that runs prisons, and then it got on the Colbert Report. So maybe we can just show that little clip. And so what happened next is that the students at the university and the faculty organized something called the Stop Alcatraz Coalition, because their mascot is an owl. And grassroots leadership and organizations around the country helped pitch in. We organized a sign-on letter of like 100 organizations around the country and sent it to the university president, and we got some more media out of it. It actually became kind of an international story. And the result was that the Geo Group had to rescind its donation to the football stadium. They had to take their name off of the stadium. But I think that is a good example of the way that this industry, when it is brought into the light and when people organize, can really make some changes. And I think that this is in some ways a superficial change, but at the same time, I think that this was an attempt by a company with a really horrendous record of human rights violations to try to go mainstream, and it was clear that they couldn't do that. And so I think on that note, it was really a success. And because it's 7:50, maybe I'll end it on that note, and I'm happy to take some questions, and I also won't be offended if people go turn on the game. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you talked about the immigrants that were detained in prison. Mm-hmm. So after they serve their time, what happens then? Do they go back to their respective country, or that's how it goes?
Yeah, I mean, so immigrants in detention in the United States are actually a much more diverse group of people than we think that they are. I was in a detention center last Friday, actually, in Livingston, Texas, and the people in detention include recent border crossers, right? So people who've just come to the United States. They include people who show up at the border and claim asylum, right? So I've known several, folks from East Africa, for instance, or the Middle East, who actually come to the border and say, I want to seek asylum, and then they're detained while their immigration proceedings happen. They also include a lot of legal permanent residents in the United States, right? So, for instance, my friend Naz was born in Singapore, but he grew up in Texas, and He ended up detained in a detention center because he pled guilty to a drug crime. And many years later, Immigration and Customs Enforcement came and took him to an immigration detention facility where he spent almost a year for a crime that he never did a day of time for, because there's a whole class of crimes that you can be deported for in the United States, even if you're a legal permanent resident. So it's kind of a complicated answer, but it's basically that it's complicated, that there's a lot of reasons that you can be detained.
I have two legal questions. One is, I'm curious about the terms of the contracts that states sign with these companies. Do they have provisions in them that deal with standard of care, level of services, that sort of thing? And if so, are they being enforced? And is that a way to attack these arrangements?
Well, I'll answer as not a lawyer, but in our advocacy, yes, I think that it varies dramatically, the level of detail that are included in the contracts based on jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? So some contracts are thick and have a lot of penalties in them, right? If there aren't, if the stipulations aren't met, other contracts, can be a couple-page contract that have basically no penalties for not meeting the terms of the contract. So, I mean, obviously, whenever you're writing a contract, right, if you're a government agency, you should be writing it in a way that is to your favor, right, and so that you can intervene when things go wrong, right, and so. I think that the better contracts are written that way. The worse contracts are written that give the companies a lot more leeway. And frankly, companies, the private prison corporations, are able to make more profit when there's more wiggle room, right? When there's more wiggle room when it comes to staffing, when there's more wiggle room when it comes to programming, et cetera. And so it's actually, we've seen companies walk away from facilities when they're not profitable enough. And so sometimes that has to do with the contracts being too rigorous.
I have a question about the Idaho facility. When I first read about it in the Dirty Dozen, I thought maybe they literally did have a gladiator school because it'd be one more way for them to make money, an entertainment event or something. But is that just a nickname, or do they really do that undercover?
I don't think that there are any allegations that the company was making money off of it. I think that the name happened because it was so violent, and that there were a couple cases where prisoners alleged that guards basically stood by and watched very violent fights. And I think there was even a lawsuit brought that guards had instigated a fight amongst prisoners. I don't think for profit. I think for entertainment, I guess. Yeah.
Bob, one of the issues around the contracts in Ohio is that the governor here, prior to becoming governor, was financially involved in Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers is the financial advisor to Corrections Corporation of America.
They were, at least, until, yes.
And although we haven't been able to show the bright line of connection, the contract here in Ohio is one of the weakest in all standards. So they've been able to get away with the Lake Erie facility, for instance, is packed floor to ceiling and you've probably seen this trend in gymnasium style bunk beds. Even though most Ohio prisons are 1 or 2 people to a cell, this is giant rooms, big rooms of prisoners.
Yeah, and I think you bring up another thing that I should really put into these presentations is that the revolving door between public and private corrections is moving so quickly a lot of times that it's difficult to keep tabs on that, right? And so I was just rereading one of our pieces is about the Lake Erie facility, and I think it's the head of corrections, right, in Ohio is a former Corrections Corporation of America employee, right? The last three of the last 4 heads of the Bureau of Prisons now work for private prison companies, right? So those relationships remain strong, and that, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why the companies are able to win contracts even when their records are so poor. Another example of that I think is pretty egregious is it was reported last summer that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, had basically put a deportation quota in place, and it was pressuring field offices, in particular Atlanta, Georgia. They didn't have their deportation numbers where they should be, the number of people deported, which is a really backwards law enforcement model, right? I mean, you don't set quotas for how many people you need to detain or deport. And the guy who wrote those memos, who it came out, was the person who'd basically been pressuring field offices to get his deportation numbers up. When the report came out, all the report said he was formerly at ICE. He was formerly at ICE. So we just Googled him, right? Where's he at? And his LinkedIn profile says he's now an executive at Geo Group, at the private prison industry. So the guy who literally funneled more immigrants into detention, right, is now working for the company that is profiting from that. So,
can you speak to the profiteering aspects with regards to inmates being used for labor contracts and working outside of the prison to secure contracts for the private prison?
Yeah, I would say it's a relatively small portion of the money involved. I have seen communities go to bat to keep prisons open, both public and private facilities. Like, for instance, in states where the capacity of the corrections population is shrunk, but communities are basically fighting kind of YIMBY, yes in my backyard kind of fights to keep their prison open, that one of the things that they've touted, right, is that, well, you know, the prison provides so much labor to the city that if you take it out, then, you know, you're going to have to pay people to do this, right? Pay people in the free world to do it. But I think by and large, the vast majority of the money that is made off of prisons is made from warehousing people in them. It's not as much the products going out. There are counterexamples, but I think in terms of the grand scheme of the money and what's driving the incarceration, I think that it's a relatively small amount.
A follow-up legal question. If a lot of the agreements don't have adequate safeguards and standards that the companies have to follow, and that seems to lead to disparate treatment and experiences that these prisoners have, does that lead to any kind of legal arguments that could be brought against the state on equal protection grounds or anything like that? And I realize you said you're not a lawyer, but if anybody in the room has a perspective on that, I'd like to hear it.
I like to say so many of my best friends are lawyers that I don't need to go to law school, so I'm sure there's somebody in this room that can answer that question. I mean, we have certainly seen litigation brought on conditions issues, and almost always, and this is an argument that we make as an advocacy organization, that states and counties and the federal government shouldn't enter into these agreements because they're still open, right? It exposes them to liability as well, right? And so one of the things that you know, our legal allies almost always do is name the state agency in the lawsuit as well, because that's ultimately where the custody authority lies, right? So, but somebody else may have an answer to that.
We have time for just one more question.
Well, the question I had is that recently in Cincinnati, a judge was arrested and given time for sentencing children to a privatized youth facility. How does the privatization affect sentences of the inmates?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was actually in Pennsylvania, the Cash for Kids scandal, right, where basically 2 judges were accepting bribes from for-profit companies that operated youth detention facilities. I haven't heard of many other examples that were that explicit. I do think that the company's influence in many different regards, right, from their involvement in the American Legislative Exchange Council to the amount of money that they give legally, right, via campaign contributions and lobbying expenditures, influences the system, right? We certainly know an example in Texas, there was a juvenile detention facility operated by the GEO Group that when the state auditor finally went in and looked at the conditions, there was like feces smeared on the walls, there was an insect infestation, the fire locks were padlocked shut. And he came back and said, it's actually Will Harrell, the former director of the ACLU of Texas, who had been brought on to help clean up the Texas Youth Commission at the time. He came back with his report, and the state moved to close down that facility. The private prison corporation increased its lobbying expenditures that year by 10 times to $100,000, right, to try to keep that facility open and to influence policy. So I think sometimes it's the legal sort of influence that is even more insidious. So.
Thank you, Bob, very much for coming. My name is Melissa Bilancini, and I'm Policy Coordinator at the ACLU of Ohio. I just wanted to take 1 minute to thank everyone for coming, especially when there's a very exciting game tonight. And also to encourage you, if you're not involved in Grassroots leadership, to please go on their website and get involved in the work that they're doing. It's great work. And if you are not yet a member of the ACLU of Ohio, I encourage you to become a member this evening before you leave, or to join online at a later date. Thank you very much and have a great night.